So welcome everyone to the webinar on for creating community solutions, part of the National Dialogue on Mental Health. And those of you who are with us today have signed on to learn more about organizing multiple conversations across your community, and we're delighted that you're with us today. So today what we're going to do is we're going to say a few things about the overall initiative, and then we're going to focus on the top things that you will need in order to know in order to organize multiple conversations. And among those things are things like building a planning team and recruiting facilitators and participants and planning for actions. And of course, involved in each of these things is a multitude of other things. And so we will be covering these in the most organized way we have thought of, and then I'm sure you'll have questions. And so if at any time during this webinar you have a question or a comment, please put that inside the question field. And Raquel Goodrich, who is with us from the National Institute for Civil Discourse, will be collecting questions and comments, and we will be tending to those at the end of the presentation. So let me introduce ourselves. There are two panelists today, and I'm Martha McCoy, Executive Director of Everyday Democracy. We're a national organization, and our mission is to help communities find ways to bring people together from all parts of the community so that they can talk about the issues, listen to each other, and work together to make the community a stronger and better place for everyone. And with me today is...
Hi, this is Daniel Clark, Deputy Director with AmericaSpeaks. AmericaSpeaks, like Everyday Democracy, is focused on building dialogue and deliberation with a focus on national discussions, just like the mental health discussion we're talking about here today. Thanks.
Great. And I have to say, for Daniel and myself, and for other groups who have been part of the planning for and working with the White House and HHS on this national initiative, we are really excited to be part of something that gives people an unprecedented opportunity to take part in a conversation like this that is national in scope and is also focused on community solutions. And we're also delighted that you all are here with us on the line today. So we'd like to hear a little bit about what brought you to today's call. So I'm going to take this quick poll. So if you could select one of these. So how many people are you hoping to engage through your conversations on mental health? Giving you a wide range of places where you could put up to 30, or B, 30 to 60, or C, 60 to 100, or D, over 100, or E, maybe you don't really know yet how many people you hope to engage in your conversations on mental health. So Raquel will bring this up for us when most of you have voted. Oh, very interesting. So many of you are, 17% of you are hoping to engage from 30 to 60 people. That's great. 6% of you up to 30, which is still a very healthy number. Nobody is coming in at the 60 to 100 range, but there are over 28% say over 100, and 50% of you are still deciding, probably based on what you hear in today's webinar. So that's very interesting, and that's very helpful. Great. So let's move on to another question that will help us think about the best way to be helpful to you today. And we want to make sure that we connect with your concerns. So select all that apply in this question. So which of the following tasks do you have the most concerns about? Developing messaging and other communications. B, recruiting a lot of participants. C, recruiting diverse participants. D, identifying and training facilitators. Or E, getting from conversations to actions. It'll be interesting to see what kinds of tasks you all are concerned about. If you have another kind of concern that wasn't on this list, please write that in the comment field so that we can be collecting those as well. Oh, this is interesting as well. So messaging and communications, big concern, which is great. Recruiting a diversity of participants ranks up there very high, with people being concerned about numbers, but probably correctly being more concerned about how do we recruit for diversity. Identifying and training facilitators, a little bit smaller in terms of people's concerns. And lastly, the one that really ranks high up there is getting from conversations to actions. So this is very useful. It gives us a sense of where we should be talking about next steps today. So that's great.
Martha, this is Raquel. If I may, there's a couple answers that have come into the chat box under the other category.
Oh,
and
great.
So we have getting buy-in from authorities, budgeting and working with other organizations, and then the last one is organizing a diverse planning team.
Great. That's great. We'll make sure we try to hit all those as well. So thanks, Raquel. So let me just back up a little bit before we get into the how-tos of the organizing multiple conversations. And let me give you a big picture on the national dialogue on mental health. Earlier this year, President Obama called for a national dialogue on mental health, and he also called on Secretary Sebelius, Secretary of HHS, Secretary Duncan of the Department of Education, and General Shinseki of Veterans Affairs to help launch a national dialogue on mental health. And the focus on this, as is evident in the President's comments, is that we still have millions of people in the United States who do not access treatment, do not access or receive treatment for mental illness or mental health challenges. And we also realize that there is a lot of reluctance to speak about these issues, either for ourselves or for our loved ones or in our communities. And that makes it a particularly kind of challenging issue to deal with. And it also is one that the President and the secretaries he's called on and we in the deliberative democracy community really believe that conversations can really help make a difference on this, can really help advance this making a difference on this issue. So the National Dialogue on Mental Health has 3 components. The first component is an active social media strategy that's going to be run by the Department of HHS, Health and Human Services, and a lot of that is really going to be focused on bringing mental illness and mental health out of the shadows. Giving people a sense that, hey, this is something we can talk about. Just like we can talk about our physical health and our physical wellness, we can talk about our mental health. And we can tackle it as an issue in our country and in our communities. And then the second part of the strategy is really that there are national partners, national stakeholders, who have signed on in one way, shape, or form to be part of the national dialogue on mental health, whether it's through bringing their congregations, in the case of the Southern Baptist Convention, into dialogues on mental health, or whether it's the National Broadcasters Association broadcasting public service announcements. There are over 200 partners who have signed on to be part of this. And then the part that we're concentrating on is part of the strategy, the third leg of the strategy, which is really called creating community solutions. So what is this part of the strategy? In this part of the strategy, our goal is to organize hundreds and thousands of community conversations and action plans all over the country. Our goal here is really ambitious. We would like to see conversations happening in every state, and not only every state across the country, but also every county, every town, city, and county across the country. And so this is going to happen not only through the work that's going on in 10 lead sites that are doing large-scale events beginning next month, but it's also beginning in a wide variety of other ways, whether small discussions in church basements or in schools or firehouses, whether online dialogues, whether in larger-scale planning processes. And what is really central to all of this as part of this strategy is that there are action plans where people and organizations and public officials can work together to figure out what can we do to actually make a difference in our community. And we wanted you to see the Creating Community Solutions website. We wanted to make sure that all of you have a chance to visit it regularly and to check out this interactive map, which is on the home page of the website, where you can see that people from all over the country are putting pins in the map to say, yes, I am going to hold some level of conversation in my community, whether it's a small group or whether, in the case of what you all are interested in today's webinar, multiple conversations across our community. And so this website is a resource, so we encourage you to go to the map, put a pin on the map if you haven't already. All the pin signifies is that you are planning an event, and you can begin to share with other people what are the ideas that you have about that event, who are you hoping to engage, when are you hoping to have it, what kinds of organizations are involved. And that way, when you scroll across one of the pins on the map, you can go and you can see who else is doing what. The red pins, by the way, signify the 10, right now not quite 10, but right for now 6 lead sites that are organizing large-scale events that will be showing a representative sample of their community where hundreds of people are coming together to launch a dialogue and action kind of initiative in their communities. So I urge you to go to this and to make sure that you use this website. And I hope that when you go there, you'll also feel the excitement of what you're doing in your community. And oftentimes when we organize dialogues in our communities, it's very easy to feel like we're alone and that, that there aren't other people doing it. And in this case, we know that this is a national effort, and over the next 6 months, people all over the country will be organizing these conversations, and you can look on the map and know who you can reach out to and know that you're not alone. There are 3 goals of the conversations, the Creating Community Solutions conversations. The first, we want to get Americans talking about mental health. We know that there are a lot of misperceptions that are still existing out there when it comes to just knowledge about the kinds of mental health challenges people face or the nature of recovery. The Center for Disease Control has said that nearly 60% of Americans still think that issues of mental health are only a matter of willpower. So we know that there is a huge education gap there. Secondly, the goal is to find innovative community-based solutions to mental health needs, particularly with a focus on young people. And the reason for that is that for 75% of people who have mental health challenges, those symptoms began to show up between the ages of 13 and 24. And so we know that if we include young people in the conversations that and really listen to what they have to say and really focus on them as part of the conversation and part of the ways that we need to act on this, that we can take a huge leap forward in supporting people and communities. And then our third goal in Creating Community Solutions is to develop clear steps for communities to build on the conversations and to build on what they have already done in their communities. So we realize this isn't starting over. It's not starting from scratch. These conversations will complement existing local activities, and they will help be a springboard for activities to come that will build on what people talked about in their communities. And so we're thinking in terms of promoting, promoting the conversation or prevention or access to treatment. All these things are things that communities can come up with, and they can take concrete steps. And we know from today's poll that you all are particularly interested in figuring out how to move from the conversations to the action steps. So let's get to some of the how-tos of how do we organize multiple conversations in ways that address some of the challenges you all mentioned. So Daniel, you could take it from here.
Yeah, so the next slide here has to do with just around the benefits of having multiple conversations, which I think Martha has touched on across some of her comments. But I think probably the two biggest parts are one, just creating greater awareness and leading to larger impact, the larger number of people that you engage, and the ability to really generate a lot of different ideas, especially if you're able to engage a real good diverse cross-section of whether it's of citizens or stakeholders around this issue. It is, of course, a big undertaking, and so hats off to many of you, including everybody, those that are looking to try and engage over 100 people in their conversations over time. So if we could jump to the next slide there. We're going to it starts to talk about creating a planning team, and the two most important and most difficult tasks for your planning team are the last two bullets there, the recruiting participants and planning for action. And we'll talk a little bit about these pieces later, but really to position yourself and your team and to accomplish these tasks, you really need to get the right individuals and the right organizations and forming the right partnerships on your planning team. They'll also help you plan the conversations and recruit facilitators. But I think those are more straightforward tasks. The recruiting participants, especially from some of the harder to reach groups or some of the focus groups like youth and economically disadvantaged that we're going to talk about later, it is so important that you are working through existing organizations that people trust, that know and trust. It's when you're trying to recruit somebody to come to be part of a conversation, something they're maybe not familiar with, coming to meet with people that they don't necessarily know. It's helpful, almost necessary, that they be invited by somebody that they already know and trust. And then, of course, planning for action, to ensure that you really have the opportunity to impact some of the policy or actions that can be taken by some of the relevant organizations that citizens who want to work on this, so that it can have the support of some of the mental health organizations in the area. It's important to have some representation from some of those stakeholder groups as a part of your planning team as well. One of the tensions that always exists in forming a planning team, and I'm sure some of you have dealt with this sort of work before, but trying to have enough of trying to get all the right organizations and individuals on your planning team without it becoming too big and unwieldy in its own. I would, if my planning team is beginning to approach 10 or even 8 people, I begin to get a little bit nervous about managing it, and I typically want to begin to introduce some structure and possibly having some subcommittees where most of the work is done. Especially if you're trying to engage over 100 people, just in terms of all the work that has to be done to recruit people and manage logistics and so forth. I would very much, I would tend to organize a subcommittee on outreach and recruiting participants, a subcommittee that is more about strategy and how we're linking this to action and so forth. you know, and possibly more from there. That's it on the planning team. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to try and move through, you know, some of this reasonably quickly, so we have some time for your questions and so forth at the end. Conversation groups. You know, the design here is to have small discussion groups, 8 to 10 people, that you are have 2 facilitators for each group, so that you try and create a lot of diversity within each of these groups. You know, I think from lots of experience, you know, that 8 to 10 maybe is sort of a sweet spot in terms of, you know, enough people that you have enough diversity of ideas, enough energy. You're not dependent on each and every person to, you know, hold up the energy of the conversation, but it's also still manageable, and you can give everyone a chance to participate in a real meaningful and substantive way. Our recommendation, our strong recommendation, is that you have 2 facilitators for each of your groups, so that will potentially increase, you know, the number of facilitators that you need to recruit and train. You know, I think it's depending on how you're organizing. We'll talk about the format of the meetings later. You can, if you're doing a large one-day event with over 100 people, you can achieve diversity at the table just through random table assignments. It's often very effective. One thing, if you're going to be engaging youth, we often make a decision. Either we want to have youth tables with youth groups with facilitators who are very good at working with youth, or we want, if we're going to mix youth with other older people, we tend to want to at least keep 2 youth together at each group. Otherwise, they might feel a little bit isolated and more reticent. So, in terms of how you're organizing your diverse participants. And I don't believe this is posted yet, but the community conversation discussion guide, you know, is very detailed, very structured, gives lots of guidance in terms of how you know, we would suggest that you design and structure the conversation so that the most, you know, it's a lot of time and thought has gone into it, and so it takes some of that responsibility off of you. And also, following the design will, you know, help ensure that the results and the outputs that come out of your conversations are consistent in nature with and structure with the results that are coming from all the other conversations, so they can more easily sort of flow up to some of the national policy making that will be taking place as a result of this. Could go to the next slide then, please. Just talking about the sequence of the conversations. For those groups that, you know, where you have a real committed group, the intent is to go through a series of conversations. It could either be a better part of a day where you go through all 4 parts, or you could spread them out over, you know, a couple of weeks. The discussion guide, Martha, if you want to jump in here in terms of some of the specifics, but, you know, the 4 sessions, there's really just around getting the conversation, getting people to talk about the issue, how they're related to it, what it means to them, and then beginning to focus on some of the specific challenges that need to be addressed as related to the mental health issues. There's a session that's focused on issues for youth, and then the final session is really around developing community solutions and follow-on actions that this group can take or be recommending to others.
So I'll just jump in here,
yeah.
if I could, just to say that the guide is not yet up on the Creating Community Solutions website. That and the organizing guide, which is also very pertinent to today's call, should be posted, we hope, within the week. We're still waiting. It's still going through some approval channels, and so we're very much hoping that those will be posted. And also to add that the information brief that is online right now is under the resources section of creatingcommunitysolutions.org. There is also a smaller version of that that you can use to look at the national challenges, and also you may also want to collect some local data as part of your conversation so that in your community you can be saying, this is what we're facing here. Here are some of the challenges when it comes to mental health, and here are some of the strategies that have been tried already, because that will help feed into the conversation.
So if we could go to the next slide, is about different formats for the conversation, specifically the option of doing sort of one full-day event where you would cover, try and cover all of this content with possibly with multiple discussion groups happening in parallel, or spreading it out over several days or weeks. The one-day event, that is something that is what AmericaSpeaks has traditionally done. I think some of the advantages of that are having lots of people together in one venue, whether they're in the same room or whether they're in breakout rooms, and how that can kind of build some of that, helps sort of build some of the energy of the different groups can build on each other. It concentrates, it's a disadvantage, it can be a real significant lift in terms of logistics and managing lots of people at the same time. You will need lots of facilitators and volunteers, because nobody can really do double duty for you in facilitating multiple groups over time. On the benefit side of that is that it's a very focused, it's a very busy and hectic time to produce a large one-day event, but it does focus all of your time and resources in perhaps a relatively short period of time. The multiple conversations over several days or weeks, I think, has the advantage of sometimes being a little easier to manage, because you can, you're only, and sometimes a little easier to get people to participate, because you're only asking them for, 90 minutes or 2 hours of their time at each point. You can, if you have, your facilitators and others can potentially, if they are willing and able, can facilitate different groups for you. I think when people meet over a period of time, they have time for reflection and other between the meetings, and it sometimes allows, I think, ideas to develop and different sorts and a different sort of relationship to develop between the participants as they work together over a period of time. I think it talks about doing either a period of days or a period of weeks. I think it's important here that you don't stretch things out too much, because then you can sort of lose the energy, or you can lose participants if you're doing it once, if you're doing it once a month. I think in this case I would think seems a little too far apart. So if you're working with some existing groups that already meet once a month, then that's clearly sort of the route that you might go. Another way to also do the multiple conversations over several days a week, as mentioned, there is potentially doing a large event, maybe just a shorter event that sort of generates a lot of the interest and the buzz and generates some of the ideas, and then organizing the follow-up sessions in the following weeks.
And Daniel, I'll add in here just that we've also seen it done in terms of multiple conversations over one day in a very large community, so that there's a buzz because people know that this is happening, but it's happening in many locations across a city, for example. So there's variations on how to do that, or that might be a way to launch things, and then people continue conversations in their neighborhoods and then come back together in a large-scale event at the end. So it's all different kind of ways of kind of combining, what you were saying, Daniel, the small group intimacy with the large community-wide sense of energy that as a community we are coming together. And so multiple conversations adds a little bit to the urgency of communicating that this is happening and keeping that buzz alive. So,
yeah, and then I was going to move on to the next slide, if you wanted to take it from there, Martha.
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah, so of course all of that is really related to that communication challenge and what the invitation should clearly be communicating to folks that you're involving either as participants or as facilitators or even initially as members of your planning group, to be really clear about what you're trying to accomplish, what goals you have in mind, what kinds of changes would you like to see in the community as a result of having the conversations and as a result of building the action steps from those conversations, and always keeping in mind that the person you're talking to is really seeing it from their perspective, either, say, as somebody who is a public official, a member of one of the stakeholder groups in terms of mental health, or someone in the larger community who is very tied to what will come out of this conversation, or whether it's a participant who says, you know, why should I participate? What is this really about? Because we all know, all of us who've organized these kinds of things, that once people take part in this kind of conversation, it really feels quite natural to them. But if they haven't had an opportunity to do this before, they really need a lot of cues about, you know, what is this about and why should I do it? And I think in this case, because it's part of a national dialogue on mental health, and there's this social media campaign going on at the same time, it will really help people when you build on that in your message development for your conversations, and that people can go to the Creating Community Solutions website and see that, and I think it really helps that. So let's go to the next slide and think about, you know, strategizing.
Just before you
sure.
move off of message, I think one of the challenges here is in terms of creating the communications pieces that result from that, and I think it's important to think of it in terms of the different layers that you need. You need to have sort of the very sort of simplified version that generates interest, tells them people just enough that they have some sense of what it is, but doesn't overwhelm them with information. You know, it should fit on 1 or 2 PowerPoints, or, you know, if that's the medium you're using, and then you and then how you sort of lay out additional information piece by piece, or direct them to additional information as needed without overwhelming them. And if you can have a good communications person on your planning team, that can be a big help.
That's a great addition, Daniel. And I also wanted to say that, yes, for example, when you're recruiting members of the planning team, there would be, you know, they would want more information about what does this mean for the community and why am I investing my time in this. When you're developing for the planning team a set of talking points, when they're talking to other sponsors or potential participants, it really is that set of a few bullet points that are clearly explaining to people why should they be part of this. And yes, having communications really does help on your planning team. And part of that is really on strategizing, you know, how you reach out to potential participants. And as we know, the #1 predictor of why anyone participates in any kind of community event, anything related to a dialogue or a community meeting, is that someone that they know and trust asks them to participate. That is really the #1 predictor. So if you're trying to recruit a lot of participants, this strategizing on how to reach out to potential participants, especially when you're trying to reach broadly into the diversity of your community, is really important to focus on. And it really has a lot to do with networking, with having a diverse planning team. A lot of it starts with that. With the diverse planning team, getting in touch with other groups and individuals who are in turn reaching out to people. So it really is about creating a sense of a buzz in the community about why this is important, and also using and tapping into those relationships. And face-to-face conversations are always really critical, but as we know, the more ways in which people hear a message, the more likely they are to act on it. So it's great if people can hear it through public service announcements or online media, and that kind of way, so that it's in the air, and also at the same time that people they know and trust are reaching out to them. Some communities actually use sample dialogues to get people sort of to get a taste of the dialogue in different places, even like restaurants and diners and places like that, to give people a sense of, This is important, it's fun, it's for everyone, and it's something that's important for our community. So on the next slide, if we could go to that, really just important to think about, and I know that many of you are thinking about this because you put this in your poll answers, that it's really critical to take those extra steps to recruit groups that may be facing different kinds of barriers to participation. So be thinking in terms of who folks are and what makes it easier for them to participate, what may be standing in their way. For folks who might be holding down 2 or 3 jobs, it's really very difficult to sort of say, okay, why should I spend my time in this way? And so seeking out ways to make it possible for people to actually participate, whether it's through scheduling or thinking about where the meetings are held if you're having multiple meetings, multiple meeting sites, thinking about transportation, thinking about childcare. In this particular issue area, because we're thinking especially in terms of young people and also people with lived experience and who are recovering from mental health problems, it's really important to think about creative ways to make them know that this is going to be a safe place to have a conversation, that this is really about making sure that this issue gets talked about and that there's a way to do that in a way that everyone is learning together and we are dispelling misperceptions. We're also finding ways to take action together. Sometimes, as Daniel pointed out, with young people who are being recruited, it can be very challenging in terms of their schedules and in terms of their participation, in terms of getting there and also getting information so that when they arrive, they know why they're there. It's also training adults or people older than young people to actually be really receptive to young people and meet them where they are and making them feel welcome. And really, it's all about all of this in recruiting anyone to this conversation is really about using those personal relationships, making sure you're clear and making sure you're stating clearly what kind of conversation environment you're setting up and why people are being asked to participate and why their participation will make a difference. That is always a very, very big thing for anyone, but in particular for people who may have extra barriers to participation. Something we also mentioned here is culturally diverse groups, because oftentimes what happens in the community for people who are in ethnic groups that are not dominant in the community, it may be something that community groups often don't think about. How do we recruit from ethnically diverse and communities? And that really goes to messaging, it goes to communication, it also goes to building that diverse planning team. We'll say a couple things as we wrap up here. One on the next slide, talking about training facilitators, identifying and training facilitators. This did not rank as high on a concern, so I have a feeling that those of you on the call have probably spent time doing this, but so this is just a reminder of the kinds of folks you're looking for and the kinds of training, and there are resources you will find in the resource section on the website about training facilitators. And I'd also like to highlight that young people make fabulous facilitators, and it would be great in particular when young people are going to be really heavy participants in these conversations to have young people as facilitators, because that really makes using your voice when you're a young person easier to do when someone who is young is facilitating the group. To go to the event details, there are, Daniel was saying, there are lots of things to consider when you're organizing, especially when you're bringing together people or you're organizing multiple conversations for over 100 folks. There are things that you want to consider providing because it really makes it easier for people to participate. And of all of the ones on this list, we would say that the first, of course, location and scheduling, and then the last one on the list, distributing materials to team members, they're really kind of core essentials. refreshments are always good. It always brings people to have food. And all these other things, childcare, translators, transportation, arrangements for hearing or visually impaired participants, are things that are that really can demonstrate your commitment to being inclusive and to reducing barriers to participation. But they can also add to the details of what you are and to the cost and the complexity of what you're organizing. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're thinking about your event details. And this thinking about planning for action is something that could actually merit a webinar of its own. And I think that really came out in the way in which you answered your polling questions. This planning for action is something that should be happening from the beginning of organizing. So when Daniel was talking about the subcommittees that are part of the planning team, it's really important to think early on about having a subcommittee that is really dedicated to planning for the action steps that will come out of the conversation. One of the things we've seen over time is that because the action comes after the conversation, sometimes people think, well, we'll think about action when we get to that part. And really, that's a problem, because by the time the conversations have been held, typically what happens is the people who've been organizing the conversations are pretty wiped out. They've been doing all this work to get people into conversations and to train facilitators and to set up either a day-long event or multiple events around the community or multiple dialogues around the community, and they're kind of tired. But meanwhile, the people who've been participating in the conversation are energized. They come out of the conversation and they're ready to oftentimes to take action on what they've just been talking about. And that's why I think it's important, and we've discovered it's important to have a small team of people who from the very beginning are thinking about ways to work with the people who have come out of conversations, who are working on particular actions that have come out, so that there is a team of people ready to support those people who are working on action steps. The planning for action can really happen in a couple of ways, at least a couple of ways. At a big one-day event, at the end of the event, people will have a chance to share their action ideas at the end of the day, often through voting on priorities and thinking about things they can do. If you're having multiple conversations, then oftentimes it's really useful to plan a separate event, sometimes called an action forum, where people can come from the conversation groups, share their ideas, prioritize the action ideas that have come out of it, and begin to create action teams at that event. Daniel, is there anything you want to add on this one before we move to questions?
No, it would be good to open it up for questions with the time we have left.
Okay, great. So we have 15 minutes left, so either you can type in a question that Raquel will see and pass along, or you can raise your hand next to your name. And when Raquel calls on you, please introduce yourself and say where you're from.
Yeah, and if you're typing your question into the chat box, go ahead and say where you're from also. It's interesting to hear, the different locations and where people are coming from. So we have a couple of questions that have come into the chat box as you both, Martha and Daniel, have been speaking. And so let's go to some of those. We have a question from Larry Spears. What are the specific uniform products that you want from each conversation? And then how is the product documented to be helpful to the national effort? Martha, do you want to try to answer that one?
Sure. On the website, you'll go, when you register and put your conversation on the map, you'll also see that there's a way to capture outcomes in the conversation that you can actually be providing then also to the national conversation. And so there are things that are going to be following along from the guide itself that you will be able to see, that are things such as, what are our top challenges in this community? What do we see as a couple of top challenges we're facing? what are the most important things we think young people are facing? What are the 3 or 4 top action priorities that we see in our community? So there will be questions like that that you will be able to see that will be able to guide, will follow along from the conversations that you have, but will also be able to upload into the website. And then you'll also be able to look at what comes out of others as well.
Perfect. We had a similar question from Tracy Lutz, and I hope I'm getting your last name correctly. And her question is, will we hear action ideas from other events? So along those lines, Martha, do you want to speak to that and how the website can help with that?
Yes, so that this is great because there's going to be transparency so that people can go online and they can see what are the action ideas that are coming out of different community conversations. And as you see that, you'll be able to, I think it'll be great because it'll really be a way to energize conversations and to also set up relationships where you might even be wanting to sort of check in with what's going on in different communities so that you can find out ideas for your own community.
All right, another question coming in from Carolyn K. Wood. Must participants commit to the full series, and what if they can't?
Yeah, I would.
Okay, go for it, Daniel.
I can speak to that. I mean, I think, I think as you've kind of heard from the intent is that people would participate in all 4 sessions. I think, inevitably, in an effort to be inclusive, you always have people who really want to participate in 2 or 3 of them, but just cannot make one of them. I think you just need to manage that as best as you can. I think you almost always, even if people commit to all 4, some people who can't make a session, I think, if you have a good deal of that, you just have to think you might take some extra time either to bring them up to speed before they come to the session after they've missed, how the group can incorporate them back into the conversation or introduce them to the conversation if they've missed the first session. So I think the desire really is here to do a series of meetings. Now that being said, when the discussion guide comes out, you'll see that it's got 2 parts. One part is this series of 4 sessions that really goes deep into the issue over time. But there's several other suggested ways, whether it's doing a one-time event, focusing just on one of the topics, whether it's planning for action or something else. So if you really don't have the other options, if you don't have a group of people who can commit to a series of meetings, then look using the discussion guide in some of these other ways to do maybe some one-time events, but maybe doing several of them over a period of time.
I think that's right, and I think that the aim is to try to provide as much of the experience for people as possible as they can do, and having people meet multiple times, as Daniel said, really does enhance people's deepening understanding of the issue and also their connection with each other. So whether that's in a one-day event or in multiple sites around the community. Sometimes if people have to miss one time, it really is great because that's a role for one of the facilitators to check in with them and help them know what they missed and bring them back in, as Daniel said, being as inclusive as possible. The ideal is yes.
Great. We have a couple of questions specific to the lead cities. So the first one is coming in from Sarah Giles from Portland, Oregon. I know that mayors from the main cities are involved. How else do you envision leaders being part of the conversation?
That's a great question, and I think that just like in the lead cities, it would be great to have public officials who are willing to step forward to say that they were committed to this conversation in their community and that they wanted to see this happen as a way to improve mental health in their community. there's a way in which having this be part of a national conversation and also having local leadership step forward and say, we are committed to helping making this happen. Really being on the planning group, for example, having the city or the county or both as part of a planning group really does add visibility, and it also adds a sense of commitment from officials that they are going to take seriously the results of the conversations and as much as possible work with the group to act on those. And this, of course, gets into questions of resources and questions of capacity, but I think the ideal is to have officials who are willing to step forward and say, yes, we would like to see this happen in our community, and we're willing to really use the bully pulpit to get people there and to also be part of a planning group.
We've got another question from Larry Spears in regard to the lead sites. Do any of these lead sites have Republican mayors? And so his concern is about the politics of it being a presidential initiative.
Oh, right. Well, so far, and I can speak to this directly, is because Everyday Democracy is working with the site of Albuquerque, and it has a Republican mayor, Mayor Richard Berry. So, yes, we were very excited because we see this as a bipartisan and transpartisan initiative, and so we're excited that Mayor Berry joined as one of the lead sites. Some of the lead sites are still emerging, you'll see, and so stay tuned on that question. But yes.
I'm not seeing any hands raised, so I'm going to keep going with the questions coming in through the chat. But if you'd like to raise your hand, what I can do is take you off mute and you can ask your question. So feel free to do that, and I'll just continue to do the chat questions. We've got a couple of questions that came in from Hannah, and Hannah is from New Haven. First question is, have people tried using incentives to keep participants coming back? And then another question is, I'm wondering about working families in our cities and perhaps how we might be able to engage them.
Great question. When it comes
certainly
to
on the issue of incentives, we have certainly done different things from time to time, at least for some of our larger meetings and where we had some resources. One thing that can be fun and is more, this would be more for an all-day event, or I guess you could do it for Series 2, would be sort of a raffle, and people are able to enter the raffle. If they stay they have to stay the entire day to participate in the raffle, or I guess if it was a series of meetings, every time they attend, they get to add, enter the raffle again. Is a fun thing to do, and sometimes you can get you can get the prizes donated from some local organizations. Sometimes just paying a transportation stipend of $15 or $20 or $10, anywhere between $10 and $20 can be, instead of making it available to those who request it, can be a helpful incentive as well. And some people will truly need it.
And childcare can fit into one of those as well, as well as having food at the event. And that I would say that for working families in particular, it's really difficult in terms of, we all know what dinner time can be like, and trying to make things happen and trying to pull things together. And so having childcare, having food, paying attention to people's scheduling needs is really critical when it comes to that, because people are very busy and trying to fit a lot into their lives, and yet we know that it's really critical to hear from those families. In particular, if people are facing, if members of their family have mental health challenges that they're really wrapped up in dealing with as well, they really want to be hearing from those folks, but it could also bring additional barriers in terms of their time to participate. So I would say really listening to people about what they need when they're being recruited, what would they need in order to have the time or the space to participate.
Great. Another question from Kimberly, and she's from North Carolina. How does this initiative relate to the SAMHSA initiative community conversations about mental health, similarities and differences?
It is. It is the national initiative that I was describing at the very beginning, where the president called for a national dialogue on mental health. Part of what he did was charge the Department of Health and Human Services and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, within that, to actually carry out this national dialogue on mental health. So this is one and the same. And I described that there were, so actually the deliberative democracy community has been working directly with SAMHSA to help create the materials for these community conversations. So this is part of what SAMHSA has been doing to actually forward the national dialogue on mental health. This is part of that. And I mentioned, and some may have missed this as it was the very beginning, is that SAMHSA has also recruited national stakeholders to be part of this as well. So people could be, organizations may not have signed on necessarily for the creating community solutions part of this, where they're actually organizing conversations, but they may have signed on for to be a stakeholder partner in other ways, for example, creating public service announcements or raising the visibility of the issue. So there are lots of ways that organizations can be involved, but in this particular part of the National Dialogue on Mental Health, we're really focusing on how do you help communities create conversations.
I've got a couple more questions in the chat box that I'll get to. So if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to submit them or go ahead and raise your hand. Kind of a point from Larry Spears regarding incentives. Consideration can be given to T-shirts, which can have a catchy and bright color message about the importance of the dialogue on mental health. And then he had a question. How is the mental health discussion related to violence in communities?
I think that's an important conversation because this whole national dialogue on mental health really grew out of the concerns that were being raised in the country post Newtown shootings in December. And so I think it really provides a context where people realize that it's really important for people, young people in particular, but everyone who has mental health challenges to be able to seek help when they need it and not have to suffer in silence from the stigma they may face. It's also important because it's also ironically sort of part of the misperception that can surface, which is that sometimes it can be easy to think that most violence actually stems from people with mental health challenges, whereas actually it's more likely for someone with a mental health challenge to actually be a victim of violence rather than a perpetrator. And there's a very, very small percentage of violent crimes that are actually carried out by people with diagnosed mental health challenges. So part of this is actually, I would say it provides the context because it often is it's the kind of thing that actually prompts people to look at the issue. But I would also say that when they have a chance to look at the broader array of information, they get a sense of the realities when it comes to it and how important it is for us not to think of when we think of violence, to think of those with mental health challenges, that we really need to use this as an opportunity to bring this out of the shadows, to give people a sense of how they can talk about it. And I think in some communities, actually, those safety concerns will probably, again, probably help jumpstart the conversation, but the idea is that the conversation will become much, much broader than that.
Great. I've got one last question. This one's from Carolyn Kaywood, and she is a fellow of the Hampton Roads Center for Civic Engagement in Southeast Virginia. Has an invitation gone out to the mayors, and would the mayor of my city have received something about this that I can reference? I think this is a great question on how we might involve the mayors of different cities.
That's great, and I think that there has not been a broadcast, invitation to mayors. There is there in the LEAD site that has actually been, very specific kinds of working to identify cities whose mayors may be, actively engaged in having a geographic spread of those communities. But in cities across the country, I know that, for example, the National League of Cities is very active in reaching out to mayors and other city officials to get them engaged in this. And so there wouldn't be specific invitations by name, for example, to a mayor, but certainly there would be. I think it's an interesting question to think of: how do we effectively reach out to mayors so that we know that they're important to this conversation, and how do we make that happen? And as far as I know, there has not been a specific call to mayors on this particular thing beyond sort of outreach from national organizations that have municipal public officials in their organization. So I think that's a great question. I think it would be a great one to discuss a way to do that.
And Carolyn just raised her hand, so I'm going to go to her. I'm going to take her off mute. She may just have a follow-up question.
Great.
Carolyn, go ahead.
Thank you. As I've participated yesterday and today, the word community has begun to raise a question in my mind that I think it may raise in our community, and that is the community going to have to fund the solutions when we currently look to mostly state government to fund mental health?
That's a great question. I think that it would make a lot of sense to think in terms of what's possible to do at the community level, but also what kinds of recommendations should be coming out of the conversations for state policymakers. And because I think that when you pull together the data for local communities, and I know this is true for Albuquerque, that as that is being pulled together, they're also looking at what is it that they hope that the state can actually help do as well. And so I would say that the conversation is on multiple levels. One is, what are we dealing with here in our community? But it's also, what do we think should be happening at the state level? And that's another important aspect of the conversation.
Great. That's all the questions I received.
Great. And I also will add, thanks Raquel and Carolyn, I'll also add to that I think that it may be really important to think about state level folks that you might add to your planning committee locally if you are getting local public officials engaged, that you might also be reaching out to the state to see how they would like to be involved so that they can be there from the very beginning and part of that conversation as well. Well, thank you all very much for being part of today's webinar, and Daniel and I and Raquel are really pleased that you could be here, and thank you for joining. And we wanted to make sure that if you had follow-up questions, Matt Leininger, who is Executive Director of the Deliberative Democracy Consortium, for now is playing a role where he's fielding questions from folks around the country who are trying to organize, especially on any scale, but and following up with today's call on a larger scale, please follow up with questions to Matt, and he will direct those to folks who will be able to help you directly, because we know we were only able to really scratch the surface in today's webinar. But thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Good luck. Be in touch.
Be in touch. Go to the map. Put your pin in the map. Okay, bye.